The kid was in my kitchen eating my leftover meatloaf when I walked in with a 12-pack of LaCroix and a look that said not today. He didn't flinch, just looked up mid-bite, pointed at my fridge and said with a casual tone that made my blood boil, "Mom says everything in this house is technically communal property now. It check HOA rules." He was 17, wearing Yeezys and a trust fund Vibes hoodie, and casually scrolling TikTok while sitting in my chair. Then he added with the confidence of someone who had never faced a consequence in his life, "So I live here now." That's when I called the cops. And oh boy, they really came through. But let me back up and tell you how we got to this absolutely insane moment, because the journey to having a teenager claim squatters' rights in my own home through some made-up HOA bylaw is a story that needs to be told from the beginning. My name is Toby Harlow, and I'm a structural engineer who values precision, order, and most importantly, peace and quiet. I had recently moved into Juniper Vale Estates, a gated community that prided itself on what they called elevated living and community synergy, which in practice meant surveillance-level neighborly meddling and enough drama to fuel a reality TV show for decades. I chose Juniper Vale because the houses were well built, the property values were stable, and the community seemed quiet during my initial visits. What I didn't realize was that beneath that veneer of suburban tranquility lurked a power structure more complex than some small governments, all orchestrated by one woman who would make my life a living nightmare. The development consisted of 147 homes, all built within the last 15 years, with perfectly manicured lawns that were required to be exactly 2 3/4 inches tall according to Section 12.4 of the HOA guidelines. The streets were named after various trees that had never actually grown in this region, creating an artificial forest of asphalt and concrete. Maple Grove Circle, Birchwood Lane, and my street, Sycamore Drive, all curved through the development in a pattern that supposedly promoted optimal traffic flow but really just confused delivery drivers. I liked quiet mornings, woodworking in my garage, and minding my own business. These simple pleasures were what I looked forward to after long days spent calculating load distributions and stress patterns for commercial buildings. My workshop was my sanctuary, filled with hand tools passed down from my grandfather and projects in various stages of completion. I had plans to build a dining room table, restore an antique rocking chair, and maybe even try my hand at some decorative carving. Unfortunately, the HOA president was Nadine Kellerman, a woman who treated her title like a divine anointment from the property gods themselves. She wore pearls to mow her lawn, which she did exactly once a month for show, while her landscaping crew did the actual work. She once tried to get drones approved for what she called proactive rule enforcement, arguing that aerial surveillance would help maintain property values. The proposal was shot down, but not before she had already purchased 3 drones with HOA funds that she later claimed were for educational purposes. Nadine frequently referred to herself as Madam Chairwoman, even in casual conversation at the mailbox cluster. She had business cards printed with this title, laminated copies of the HOA bylaws that she carried in her purse, and a measuring tape that she wasn't afraid to use on anyone's lawn fence or holiday decorations. Her reign over Juniper Vale had lasted 4 years, each election seeing fewer and fewer people willing to run against her after witnessing what happened to those who tried. The last person to challenge her authority was Bob Martinez, a retired Marine who thought his military background would help him bring some sense to the board. Nadine systematically destroyed his reputation over 6 months, starting with complaints about his American flag being 4 inches too large, moving on to accusations about his dog barking at unreasonable hours despite him not owning a dog, and culminating in a special assessment that only affected his section of the street for emergency sidewalk repairs that never actually happened. Bob moved out last spring, and his house sat on the market for 3 months before selling at a $20,000 loss. Her only son, Blaze, spelled with a Y and a Z, because of course it was, had just gotten expelled from boarding school for what the official documentation called entrepreneurial mischief. The real story, which I learned from Tom, who lived 3 houses down and whose brother worked at the school, was that Blaze had been caught selling fake NFAs made from photos of school cafeteria food. He had convinced several younger students that owning a digital image of Thursday's mystery meat would be worth thousands in a few years. When the scheme collapsed and parents started asking questions, the school had no choice but to send him packing. He'd been sent home to Juniper Vale and was about to make my life extremely illegal, though I didn't know it yet. What I did know was that Nadine had been acting stranger than usual in the weeks leading up to his return, sending out increasingly bizarre HOA memos and hosting emergency meetings about topics like the spiritual energy of our communal spaces and the need for age-diverse interaction zones. The first sign that something was off came 2 weeks after I moved in. I had submitted my architectural plans for a simple garden shed to the HOA Architectural Review Committee, following every guideline to the letter. The shed would be 8 by 10 feet, painted in an approved color called suburban sage, with a roof pitch that matched my house exactly. I had even included professional renderings from multiple angles and a survey showing the exact placement on my property. Nadine rejected it personally, overriding the committee's approval, citing a new rule she had apparently just created about auxiliary structures needing to promote intergenerational community building. When I asked what that meant, she said with a perfectly straight face that my shed would need to include a youth meditation space. I thought she was joking until she handed me a revised set of plans that included what looked like a meditation corner with beanbags and mood lighting. This should have been my first warning sign, but I attributed it to typical HOA nonsense and decided to put the shed project on hold. I had more important things to worry about, like setting up my home office and getting my workshop organized. Little did I know that Nadine was already laying the groundwork for something much more invasive than shed modifications. The second warning came when I started receiving daily visits from Nadine for increasingly trivial violations. My garbage cans were visible from the street for 7 minutes longer than allowed. My porch light was 3 lumens too bright according to her light meter. The font on my house numbers was serif when the new guidelines apparently required sans serif, even though half the neighborhood still had the original numbers from the builder. Each violation came with a formal written notice, delivered by Nadine personally, always right around dinner time. She would ring the doorbell, wait for me to answer, and then read the entire violation notice out loud before handing it to me. This process usually took 10 to 15 minutes, during which she would also make observations about my lifestyle choices, the fact that I didn't have a family, and how the community really benefited from engaged residents who understood the value of collective responsibility. The third sign was when she started mentioning her son in every conversation. "Blaze is so creative," she would say while measuring the height of my mailbox. "Blaze just needs the right environment to flourish," she would mention while photographing my supposedly incorrectly placed doormat. "Young men like Blaze benefit from positive male role models," she would add while documenting that my recycling bin was facing the wrong direction. I had never met Blaze at this point, but I was already developing a strong aversion to him based solely on his mother's constant promotion. She spoke about him like he was simultaneously a misunderstood genius and a delicate flower that needed constant nurturing. The boarding school incident was referred to as a creative misunderstanding, and his previous expulsion from public school for selling exam answers was called an entrepreneurial learning experience. My first actual warning was a missing Amazon package that contained a new set of chisels I had ordered for my woodworking. The delivery confirmation showed it had been left at my door, complete with a photo, but when I got home from work it was gone. The security camera I had installed after the third Nadine visit showed a teenager in expensive sneakers casually walking up to my porch, looking directly at the camera and taking the package like he was picking up his own mail. When I confronted Nadine about it, showing her the clear video evidence, she said with a dismissive wave that packages left in common view were essentially community property until claimed. I pointed out that my porch was not common property, and she countered with some nonsense about the 3-foot easement from the sidewalk creating a gray area in property rights. She promised to talk to Blaze about it, but suggested I should be more prompt in collecting my deliveries to avoid confusion. The package mysteriously reappeared 2 days later, opened with 1 chisel missing and a note that said "borrowed for art project, will return soon," signed with just a B. The missing chisel was never returned, and when I brought it up again, Nadine acted like she had no idea what I was talking about, and suggested that perhaps I had miscounted my original order. Then came the incident with my truck. I had parked it in my driveway, exactly within the lines, following all HOA guidelines about vehicle placement and appearance. My Ford F-150 was clean, well-maintained and completely stock. There was nothing about it that could possibly violate any rules. Yet I woke up one morning to find a long key scratch running from the front fender to the rear bumper, roughly at the height a 17-year-old's hand would naturally fall. The security footage this time was less clear, showing only a figure in a hoodie walking past around 2 in the morning. But that same afternoon I saw Blaze walking down the street with his friends, and he made a point of running his key along a stick in the exact same motion I had seen on the grainy footage. When we made eye contact, he smirked and said loud enough for me to hear that some trucks just look better with racing stripes. I filed a police report, but without definitive proof. They could only document the vandalism for insurance purposes. The repair cost me $800 after my deductible, and Nadine had the audacity to send me a violation notice the next day because my truck was now considered damaged and therefore in violation of the HOA's vehicle appearance standards until repaired. The psychological warfare escalated from there. I would find my garden hose unraveled and running, increasing my water bill. My doorbell would ring at odd hours with no one there. When I checked, pizza deliveries I didn't order would show up at dinner time. My Wi-Fi would mysteriously disconnect whenever Blaze walked past my house with his phone out, which I later learned was him using a deauthorization app to kick my devices off my own network. Each incident was just minor enough that the police couldn't do much, and Nadine always had an explanation or deflection ready. "Kids will be kids," she would say, "or perhaps you're being a bit paranoid, Toby. Have you considered that you might be having difficulty adjusting to community living after being single for so long?" The gaslighting was particularly effective because she managed to convince several other neighbors that I was the problem. She spread rumors that I was antisocial, that I had complained about children playing, which I never had, and that I was trying to turn the neighborhood into what she called a sterile adult-only environment. She even suggested at one HOA meeting that single homeowners should pay an additional assessment since they didn't contribute to the community's family-friendly atmosphere. Next, I found Blaze lounging on my patio with two girls and a Bluetooth speaker blasting Pitbull at a volume that violated not just HOA rules but probably several local noise ordinances. They had set up an entire party scene on my back deck, complete with snacks they had taken from my outdoor refrigerator and towels from my pool house that I didn't even know they knew about. When I confronted him, trying to maintain my composure despite my rising anger, Blaze laughed with the casual arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences. He said, "My mom says your house is technically on HOA-owned soil, which makes me like a steward." He said this while making air quotes around the word steward, showing that even he knew how ridiculous it sounded but didn't care because he believed he was untouchable. The two girls with him giggled and took selfies with my house in the background, posting them to Instagram with captions about exclusive access and VIP treatment. One of them had the nerve to ask if I could bring them some lemonade, since they were guests of the HOA president's son. The entitlement was so profound that I was momentarily speechless, which they took as agreement and actually looked disappointed when I didn't return with beverages. When I told them to leave immediately or I would call the police, Blaze stood up slowly, stretching like he had all the time in the world. He said with a smirk that his mom had already talked to the police chief at the last community outreach meeting, and they had what he called an understanding about youth development initiatives in the neighborhood. He actually used those words, youth development initiatives, like trespassing on my property was some kind of community service project. They eventually left, but not before Blaze made sure to knock over one of my potted plants accidentally on purpose, and his friends left their trash scattered across my deck. The entire time they were leaving, they live-streamed it, narrating how they were being oppressed by what they called a boomer. Despite the fact that I'm 35 and millennials are not boomers, but I doubt any of them knew or cared about actual generational definitions. That evening, Nadine backed this up with a memo titled Interim Residency Clause for Community Youth Reformation. The document was 3 pages of the most incomprehensible pseudo-legal garbage I had ever read, and I work with contracts regularly. It was riddled with typos, grammatical errors, and legally meaningless phrases like sovereign community authority and patriarchal mentorship obligations. The basic premise, if you could call it that, was that households within the HOA had a responsibility to provide structured exposure to adult homeowners for community youth who were in transitional phases of their development. She claimed that Blaze needed this exposure as part of his alternative correctional experience, which I assumed was her way of spinning his expulsion from boarding school into some kind of therapeutic program. She cited non-existent statutes, referenced court cases that a quick Google search revealed were completely unrelated to property law, and even included a bibliography of sources that were mostly blog posts from parenting websites and one article from a magazine called Modern HOA Living, that I'm pretty sure she wrote herself under a pseudonym. The memo concluded with what she called implementation guidelines, which essentially stated that Blaze had access privileges to all common areas and transition zones within the community, which she had conveniently redefined to include private patios, driveways, and even portions of our actual homes that were visible from the street. According to her interpretation, my front door being visible from the sidewalk made my entryway a semi-public space. I consulted with a lawyer friend who literally laughed out loud when reading the document. He said it was the legal equivalent of declaring yourself emperor of your backyard and expecting the United Nations to recognize your sovereignty. He offered to write a cease and desist letter, which he did, but Nadine simply responded with another memo about the importance of community collaboration over litigation. Meanwhile, Blaze's behavior escalated. He started showing up at random times, always when I wasn't home, which meant he was either watching my schedule or his mother was using her HOA president access to check my security system, which was connected to the community's smart home network that she had insisted everyone join for safety coordination purposes. I would come home to find evidence of his presence everywhere. Food missing from my refrigerator, furniture slightly moved, the TV still warm from use. Once I found a pair of his shoes in my bedroom closet with a note that said, "Forgot these, be back for them later." The psychological impact of knowing someone had been in my most private spaces was devastating, but that was clearly the point. I installed additional locks, but somehow he always found a way in. I changed my security codes, but they would mysteriously stop working. I even put a camera inside my house, but it would conveniently malfunction during the times he entered. It was clear that Nadine was using her HOA access to facilitate her son's criminal behavior, but proving it was nearly impossible. The other neighbors were divided. Some, especially the older residents who had dealt with Nadine's tyranny for years, privately supported me but were too afraid to speak up publicly. Others, mostly newer residents who hadn't yet crossed Nadine, bought into her narrative that I was overreacting and that Blaze was just a spirited teenager who needed understanding and patience. Tom from 3 houses down tried to warn me that this was Nadine's pattern. She would identify someone she saw as a threat or simply didn't like, then slowly escalate conflicts until they either submitted to her authority completely or moved away. He told me about the Johnsons, who had lived here for 10 years before challenging Nadine on a pool installation. Within 6 months they had received so many fines and violations that they sold their house at a loss just to escape. Then there was the incident with the Martinez family, not related to Bob Martinez, who had run against her. They had the audacity to host a quinceañera that went 5 minutes past the HOA's event curfew. Nadine made their lives so miserable with daily violations and special assessments that they broke their mortgage to move early. She had even convinced the board to put a lien on their house for unpaid fines, which they had to settle at closing, costing them thousands. I started documenting everything meticulously. Every interaction, every incident, every piece of evidence. I created spreadsheets with dates and times, compiled video footage, saved every memo and email. I was building a case, though I wasn't sure yet what I would do with it. The local police seemed uninterested in what they called a civil matter, and the HOA board was completely under Nadine's control. The security system I installed was top of the line, with cameras covering every angle of my property, motion sensors, and smart locks that should have been unhackable. I also installed a separate, hidden system that wasn't connected to any network, just in case. This parallel system would prove to be the smartest decision I made during this entire ordeal. The tipping point was approaching, though I didn't know it yet. Nadine was getting bolder in her interpretations of HOA rules, and Blaze was getting more brazen in his invasions of my privacy. She had started sending out memos about something called the Community Integration Protocol, which seemed to be laying the groundwork for something bigger. The protocol outlined phases of integration for what she called community-challenged youth. Phase 1 was observation and assessment, which apparently meant Blaze could surveil my property. Phase 2 was supervised interaction, which explained the patio party. Phase 3, which she had just announced we were entering, was something called immersive rehabilitation through domestic partnership. I couldn't even begin to imagine what she meant by domestic partnership, but the phrase made my skin crawl. The memo about Phase 3 was even more unhinged than her previous communications, referencing obscure philosophical theories about communal living and citing studies about the benefits of intergenerational cohabitation that I'm certain she misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented. She had also started rallying her supporters on the neighborhood Facebook group, posting articles about the loneliness epidemic among single adults and the importance of community support for struggling youth. She never mentioned Blaze by name, but everyone knew who she was talking about. She painted a picture of a troubled teenager who just needed guidance and a community that needed to step up and provide it. What she didn't post about were Blaze's other activities in the neighborhood. The Hendersons' garden gnomes that mysteriously appeared on different lawns each morning. The Channon's koi pond that was found filled with dish soap, killing their prized fish. The recurring graffiti on the community center that always appeared right after Blaze was seen in the area, but could never be definitively linked to him. Each incident followed the same pattern. Clear circumstantial evidence, pointing to Blaze, Nadine providing an alibi or explanation, and the victims eventually giving up rather than fighting the HOA president and her seemingly untouchable son. The community was being held hostage by a teenager and his enabling mother, but speaking up meant becoming their primary target. I tried reaching out to other HOA board members, but they were either completely under Nadine's influence or too scared to act. The vice president, Gerald Hoffman, privately admitted that he thought Nadine had gone too far but publicly supported every motion she brought to the board. The treasurer, Sandra Lee, had actually tried to question some of Nadine's expenditures related to youth programs and suddenly found herself under investigation for alleged financial irregularities from 3 years ago. The secretary, Marcus Washington, was the only one who seemed willing to even consider opposing Nadine, but he was outnumbered and had privately told me that he was planning to resign at the end of his term rather than continue fighting a losing battle. He shared with me that Nadine had dirt on most of the board members, nothing illegal but embarrassing enough to ensure their compliance. It was a Saturday when I discovered the full extent of Nadine's surveillance network. I was debugging my smart home system, trying to figure out why my devices kept disconnecting, when I found hidden administrative access that shouldn't have existed. Digging deeper, I discovered that Nadine had used her HOA president authority to require all smart home devices to be connected to a central security system for emergency coordination. What she hadn't disclosed was that this gave her backdoor access to every camera, smart lock, and connected device in the neighborhood. She could see when people were home, access their doorbell cameras, and even control their smart locks if they hadn't specifically opted out of the emergency access protocol, which of course was buried on page 47 of an HOA update that no one read. This revelation explained how Blaze always knew when I wasn't home and how he kept getting past my security. It also meant that Nadine had been violating federal wiretapping laws and numerous privacy statutes, but proving it would require technical expertise and legal resources that would cost tens of thousands of dollars. I started taking countermeasures, setting up false patterns to throw off their surveillance. I would leave lights on timers, play recorded audio to make it seem like I was home when I wasn't, and sometimes park my truck down the street and walk back to observe my own house. It was exhausting and paranoid behavior, but I was determined not to let them win. The psychological toll was significant. I wasn't sleeping well, constantly worried about what I would find when I got home. My work was suffering as I spent more and more time dealing with HOA drama and security measures. I was becoming the isolated, paranoid person that Nadine was painting me as, which I realized was probably part of her strategy. Then came that Sunday morning. I had deliberately broken my pattern, leaving very early to go to the hardware store for supplies I needed to install additional security measures. I had made the trip look like I was heading to my usual weekend hiking spot, complete with hiking gear visible in my truck. I even drove past the trailhead to make sure anyone tracking my phone would think I was gone for hours. Instead, I doubled back after buying what I needed, approaching my house from a different direction than usual. I parked a block away and walked back, wanting to install the new locks without being observed. What I found when I quietly entered through my back door was beyond even my worst expectations. Blaze was fully moved in. He was wearing my robe, the expensive Turkish cotton one my sister had given me for Christmas. He was playing Call of Duty on my 65-inch TV, which he had somehow connected to his gaming console that was now set up where my cable box used to be. He was sipping orange juice straight from the carton, my orange juice, the expensive fresh squeezed kind that cost $12 a half gallon. My kitchen counter was covered with his belongings: a laptop, multiple gaming controllers, a collection of vape pens that probably violated several HOA rules about tobacco products, and what looked like a significant amount of cash in rubber-banded rolls. My refrigerator had been reorganized to make room for his energy drinks and frozen pizzas. There were dirty dishes in my sink and chip crumbs on my previously spotless couch. But the worst part was the casualness of it all. He wasn't sneaking around or acting guilty. He was lounging like he owned the place, feet up on my coffee table, using my grandmother's hand-knitted Afghan as a blanket. He had even hung up some of his clothes in the coat closet. I could see from my position. When I stepped into full view, he didn't jump or act surprised. He paused his game, looked at me with mild annoyance like I had interrupted something important, and actually had the audacity to say, "Oh, you're back early. Mom said you usually hike until at least noon." The rage I felt in that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced. This wasn't just trespassing or theft anymore. This was a complete violation of my life, my privacy, my sanctuary, and the casualness with which he admitted that they had been tracking my schedule made it clear this was all planned and coordinated. When I asked how he got in, my voice remarkably calm despite my internal fury. Blaze waved a shiny key and said with a grin, "Mom had a spare maid, for emergencies and stuff. She said you gave her permission during the last HOA meeting, but you probably forgot because you seemed really stressed about those lawn violations." I had never given anyone permission to make a key to my house. I had never even attended the last HOA meeting, because I had been traveling for work, which Nadine knew because I had submitted the required absence notification. This was breaking and entering, plain and simple, and we both knew it. I told him he had exactly 30 seconds to get out of my house before I called the police. He laughed, actually laughed, and pulled up his phone to show me a document. It was a screenshot of what appeared to be HOA bylaws, specifically a section he had highlighted that said shared responsibility zones for youth re-engagement programs. The font was clearly different from the rest of the document, and it was obviously something Nadine had created using some basic photo editing software. The section went on to describe how designated youth partners could establish temporary residency in approved households for the purpose of rehabilitation and community integration. It cited made-up statute numbers and referenced a vote that had allegedly taken place at a meeting that, according to the date listed, happened on a Sunday at 3 in the morning, which would have been impossible and illegal even by HOA standards. That's when I called 911. I didn't threaten to call them. I didn't give him another warning. I just dialed and calmly explained to the dispatcher that there was an intruder in my home who was refusing to leave. I provided the address, confirmed that I felt threatened, and mentioned that the intruder had admitted to having an illegally made key to my residence. Blaze's confidence faltered for the first time. He started texting frantically, presumably alerting his mother to the situation. He stood up, still wearing my robe, and said with less certainty, "You can't call the cops on me. My mom runs this place. She knows the police chief. This is all legal and stuff." I stayed on the line with the dispatcher, providing updates on the situation and making it clear that the intruder was now moving around my house. Blaze started grabbing his things, shoving them into a designer backpack while muttering about lawsuits and discrimination. He kept saying his mom was on her way and that I was going to regret this. The cops didn't laugh when they arrived. 2 officers showed up within 5 minutes, which was remarkably fast for a Sunday morning. They were professional and thorough, immediately separating us to get our stories. Blaze tried to show them the same fake HOA bylaw on his phone, insisting that he had every right to be there. Officer Chen, a no-nonsense woman who had clearly dealt with entitled teenagers before, looked at the document for about 3 seconds before saying, "This is forged, poorly, even if it wasn't. HOA rules don't override state and federal law. Breaking and entering is a crime regardless of what your mother tells you." That's when Nadine arrived, screeching into my driveway in her white Lexus with a magnetic HOA president sign on the door that I'm pretty sure wasn't legal. She was wearing what looked like pajamas with a blazer thrown over them and her hair in curlers, clearly having rushed over in a panic. She immediately started shouting about her authority, threatening lawsuits, and demanding to speak to the officer's supervisor. She waved a manila folder full of papers that she claimed were legal documents proving Blaze's right to be in my home. Officer Chen's partner, Officer Rodriguez, calmly took the folder and flipped through it while Nadine continued her tirade. The documents were a mix of the forged HOA bylaws, printouts from random legal websites about squatters' rights that didn't apply to this situation, and what appeared to be a crayon drawing of a house with arrows pointing to different areas labeled as community zones. I later learned that last one was supposedly an official HOA planning document that Nadine had created that morning. While Nadine was ranting, Officer Chen was taking my statement and documenting the crime scene. She photographed everything: Blaze's belongings spread throughout my house, the key he had used to enter, the damage to my property including scratches on my hardwood floor from his gaming chair and stains on my couch from his snacks. She also documented something I hadn't even noticed yet. Blaze had been into my home office and had apparently gone through my files, Several drawers were open. Papers were scattered on my desk and my laptop was logged in with failed password attempts showing on the screen. This elevated the charges from simple breaking and entering to attempted identity theft and invasion of privacy. When Officer Chen informed Blaze that he was being arrested, the reality finally hit him. His confident smirk disappeared, replaced with genuine panic. He started crying, actually crying, saying this would ruin his college applications and that his dad would kill him. Apparently his father, who lived in another state, had no idea about any of this and was under the impression that Blaze was doing well in his new therapeutic boarding school. They arrested him on the spot for breaking and entering, criminal trespassing, theft for the items he had consumed and used, unlawful occupancy, and what Officer Rodriguez perfectly described as criminal stupidity, though that last one wasn't an actual charge. As they handcuffed him, he was whining about discrimination against visionaries and how no one understood his artistic soul. Nadine tried to physically block the officers from taking Blaze to the patrol car, which resulted in her also being arrested for obstruction of justice. The sight of the HOA president being handcuffed in her pajamas and curlers while screaming about sovereign community authority was something I would treasure forever. Several neighbors had come out to watch, and multiple phones were recording the entire scene. As they were both being driven away, Nadine shouted that she would own my house when this was over, and that I had messed with the wrong family. Her threats might have been more intimidating if she hadn't been saying them through the back window of a police car while her son cried next to her. The arrest was public and spectacular. By that afternoon, videos of Blaze being handcuffed while whining about his vision and Nadine's arrest were all over social media. The HOA Facebook group exploded with comments, most expressing shock but many others sharing their own stories of harassment and intimidation by the Kellerman family. The local news picked up the story by evening. The headline, "HOA President's Son Invokes Youth Stewardship to Justify Home Invasion," was trending on Twitter, and someone had already created a meme of Blaze in my robe with the caption, "When Mom says you own the neighborhood." The story went viral, with legal experts and HOA reform advocates weighing in on the absurdity of the situation. Someone leaked the fake HOA bylaws to Reddit, where they were thoroughly torn apart by actual lawyers who pointed out everything from the Comic Sans font to the references to maritime law in a landlocked state. The document became a running joke in legal forums, with people creating increasingly absurd fake HOA rules as parody. But the real bombshell came when a neighbor who worked in IT helped authorities uncover Nadine's illegal surveillance network. The FBI got involved due to the interstate nature of some of the wiretapping violations, and suddenly this wasn't just a local HOA drama anymore. The discovery that Nadine had been accessing doorbell cameras to monitor residents' movements and using smart lock access to facilitate her son's crimes escalated everything to federal charges. Juniper Vale's property values dipped by 4.3% overnight. As news spread about the surveillance scandal, real estate agents reported that potential buyers were specifically asking about HOA governance and whether the current board was under investigation. Several residents put their houses on the market, not wanting to be associated with what some news outlets were calling the most corrupt HOA in America. I filed a formal complaint with the HOA board and obtained a restraining order against both Nadine and Blaze. My lawyer, who was having the time of his life with this case, also filed civil suits for invasion of privacy, emotional distress, property damage, and theft. He estimated that between the criminal and civil cases, the Kellermans were looking at hundreds of thousands in legal fees alone. The emergency HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening. The usual venue, a small conference room at the community center, was deemed insufficient for the expected crowd, so they moved it to the main hall. Even that proved too small, as over 300 residents showed up, many who had never attended a meeting before but wanted to witness Nadine's downfall. Local media was present, with reporters from 3 news stations and several online outlets covering what they were calling HOA Gate. The meeting was also being live-streamed by multiple residents, with thousands watching online. The atmosphere was electric, with anticipation and years of suppressed frustration finally finding an outlet. The meeting was held in the gazebo that, as we learned from the forensic audit that had been fast-tracked, cost $87,000 of misappropriated HOA funds. The original budget had been $12,000 for a simple structure, but Nadine had somehow authorized upgrades that included Italian marble, a smart weather system, and a sound system that rivaled some concert venues. Gerald Hoffman, the vice president, called the meeting to order with visible relief that he was finally free from Nadine's control. His hands shook slightly as he read from prepared notes, but his voice grew stronger with each word. He began by acknowledging that the board had failed in its duty to protect residents from abuse of power and promised immediate reforms. The first order of business was addressing Nadine's position. Since she was currently in custody and facing federal charges, she couldn't attend the meeting, though her lawyer had sent a letter demanding that any vote be postponed until she could defend herself. The board's legal counsel quickly shot this down, citing the bylaws that clearly stated any board member arrested for crimes related to their HOA duties could be immediately removed through an emergency vote. Before the vote, Gerald read aloud a summary of the forensic audit's preliminary findings. The room gasped collectively as the numbers were revealed. Over $200,000 in HOA funds had been misappropriated over the past 4 years. The money had gone to personal purchases disguised as community improvements, including a $20,000 consulting fee paid to a company that turned out to be registered to Blaze for youth engagement services that never existed. There were receipts for community enhancement supplies that were actually designer handbags, board meeting catering expenses for meals at 5-star restaurants when no meetings occurred, and emergency repair funds that went to upgrading Nadine's home theater system. She had even used HOA money to pay for Blaze's boarding school application fees, listing them as educational outreach initiatives. The surveillance network alone had cost $40,000 to implement, hidden across multiple budget items as security upgrades. The actual security company that was supposedly hired had never heard of Juniper Vale Estates, and their forged invoices were so poorly done that they misspelled their own company name 3 different ways. Isandra Lee, the treasurer who Nadine had tried to frame for financial irregularities, presented evidence that Nadine had been moving money between accounts to hide the theft, creating a complex web of transfers that took forensic accountants days to unravel. She also revealed that Nadine had been collecting late fees from residents who had actually paid on time, pocketing the extra money while sending fake past due notices. When it came time to vote, the removal was unanimous. Every single board member voted to strip Nadine of her position, and the crowd erupted in applause that lasted for 3 full minutes. Someone started chanting "No more Nadine," and soon the entire room joined in. The local news cameras captured every moment of the historic 808 uprising, but the revelations didn't stop there. Marcus Washington, the secretary, presented a list of all the illegal rules Nadine had created without board approval. There were 73 of them, ranging from the bizarre requirement that all pets had to be registered with personality assessments, to the rule that gave her son special community ambassador status that she claimed allowed him access to any property. Residents began standing up one by one to share their stories. The Johnsons, who had moved back to the area, testified via video call about the harassment they had endured. Bob Martinez attended in person, producing receipts for the thousands in illegal fines he had paid just to avoid litigation. The Chen family presented evidence about their destroyed koi pond and the emotional distress of losing pets they had raised for years. A woman named Patricia Steele revealed that Nadine had been accessing her doorbell camera to monitor when she had male visitors, then sending her violations for unauthorized guests, despite no such rule existing. An elderly couple, the Brennans, explained how Nadine had tried to force them to sell their house to her below market value by creating false code violations that would have cost more to fix than the house was worth. The stories went on for 2 hours, painting a picture of systematic abuse, harassment, and criminal behavior that had terrorized the community for years. The local news later calculated that Nadine's actions had cost residents collectively over $500,000 in illegal fines, unnecessary repairs, and decreased property values. Then came the discussion of Blaze's activities. Several teenagers from the neighborhood finally felt safe enough to speak up about his bullying and extortion. He had been charging younger kids protection fees to keep their bikes from being vandalized, selling fake hall passes at the local high school, and running what amounted to a black market for exam answers that he somehow obtained through his mother's connections. One family revealed that Blaze had been entering their home when they were on vacation, using it as a party venue and causing thousands in damage that they couldn't prove was him until now. Another resident showed security footage of Blaze spray painting his garage door with obscene images, then having his mother fine the homeowner for having graffiti on their property. The criminal behavior extended beyond property crimes. Blaze had been cyberbullying several kids in the neighborhood, creating fake social media profiles to spread rumors and embarrassing photos. One girl had to change schools because of the harassment, and her parents were considering pressing additional charges now that the truth was coming out. As more stories emerged, it became clear that the Kellermans had been running what amounted to a criminal enterprise disguised as HOA governance. They had turned a community organization meant to maintain property values and quality of life into their personal piggy bank and tool of intimidation. The board voted to pursue full criminal prosecution and civil action against both Nadine and Blaze. They also voted to cooperate fully with the FBI investigation into the surveillance network and to provide all records to the forensic accountants investigating the financial crimes. Every vote was unanimous, with the crowd cheering each decision. A new emergency election was scheduled for the following week to replace Nadine. In the meantime, Gerald would serve as acting president with full authority to begin undoing the damage. His first official act was to void all fines and violations issued in the past 2 years, pending review by an independent committee. His second was to disable the surveillance network immediately and have it professionally removed. The meeting lasted until almost midnight, with residents finally able to voice years of frustration and fear. The sense of relief in the room was palpable as people realized they were finally free from the Kellerman reign of terror. Several people actually cried, including Tom from 3 houses down, who had been documenting Nadine's abuse for years, hoping someone would eventually listen. Local news interviewed dozens of residents after the meeting, and the consensus was clear: this was long overdue. The story had now been picked up by national outlets, with some calling it the worst case of HOA corruption in American history. Legal experts were weighing in on the precedent it might set for HOA reform legislation. Meanwhile, the criminal cases were proceeding quickly. The district attorney, facing public pressure and clear evidence, fast-tracked the prosecution. Blaze was charged as an adult due to the severity and systematic nature of his crimes. The list of charges had grown to include breaking and entering, criminal trespassing, theft, fraud, extortion, cyberbullying, vandalism, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. His bail hearing was a disaster for the defense. The judge, after reviewing the evidence and noting Blaze's complete lack of remorse, set bail at $200,000. Blaze's father, who flew in from Seattle, sat in stunned silence as he learned what his son had been doing. He refused to post bail, saying that maybe some time in custody would finally teach Blaze about consequences. Nadine's situation was even worse. The federal charges for the surveillance network violations carried potential sentences of up to 20 years. The state charges for theft, fraud, and abuse of power could add another 15. Her lawyer, clearly overwhelmed by the scope of the crimes, tried to negotiate a plea deal, but prosecutors weren't interested in leniency given the systematic nature of the abuse. The FBI investigation uncovered that Nadine had been selling information gathered from the surveillance network to marketing companies, adding commercial espionage to her charges. She had profiles on every resident, including shopping habits, daily routines, and personal information that she packaged and sold for additional income. This revelation sparked a class action lawsuit that legal experts estimated could result in millions in damages. Her assets were frozen pending the investigation, which revealed she had over $300,000 in various accounts, all traceable to HOA theft and her information selling scheme. Her house, which had been extensively renovated using HOA funds disguised as community improvements, was subject to asset forfeiture. The Lexus she drove was actually leased using HOA money under a fake transportation committee budget. The investigation also revealed that Nadine had been planning to expand her operation. Documents on her computer showed she was in communication with HOA presidents from other communities, teaching them her methods for a consulting fee. She had created a website for her consulting business, HOA Excellence Solutions, where she offered courses on maximizing HOA authority and revenue generation through creative enforcement. Blaze's devices revealed his own criminal enterprise was more extensive than initially thought. He had been running online scams targeting elderly residents, using information his mother provided to seem legitimate. He had stolen thousands from retirees through fake charity drives and investment opportunities. The Cyber Crimes Division got involved, adding wire fraud and elder abuse to his charges. The school he had been expelled from sent additional evidence of his crimes there, including a scheme where he had hacked into the grading system and was selling grade changes for $500 each. He had also been caught running an illegal gambling ring and had somehow obtained and was selling copies of standardized tests. The private school was considering their own civil suit to recover damages. The trial dates were set remarkably quickly due to public interest and the overwhelming evidence. Blaze would be tried first on state charges, with federal charges to follow. His public defender, realizing the hopelessness of the case, was pushing hard for a plea deal that might reduce his sentence from the potential 40 years he was facing to something more manageable. Nadine's trial was set to be the main event. The prosecution had over 100 witnesses lined up, thousands of documents and hours of video evidence from her own illegally accessed surveillance network. Her lawyer tried to argue that accessing the cameras was within her authority as HOA president, but the judge shot this down immediately, noting that HOA rules don't supersede the Fourth Amendment. The media coverage was intense. Court TV announced they would be broadcasting both trials live. A documentary crew had started interviewing residents for what they were calling the Juniper Vale Conspiracy. 3 different true crime podcasts had already released episodes about the case, with more in production. The impact on the community was transformative. Property values after the initial dip actually started rising as buyers saw Juniper Vale as a community that had stood up to corruption. The new HOA board implemented transparency measures including public access to all financial records, term limits for board members and mandatory background checks for anyone seeking board positions. They also implemented the country's first HOA Bill of Rights, explicitly protecting residents from surveillance, harassment and arbitrary rule enforcement. It became a model that other communities across the nation began adopting. Legal scholars were calling it the most significant HOA reform in decades. Several residents, emboldened by the community's success, ran for local political offices on platforms of HOA reform. The state legislature began drafting bills to limit HOA powers and increase oversight. What had started as one man's fight against an entitled teenager breaking into his house had sparked a nationwide conversation about HOA abuse. As for me, I became something of a reluctant hero in the community. People would stop me at the grocery store to thank me for standing up to Nadine. I received letters from HOA abuse victims across the country sharing their stories and asking for advice. My inbox was flooded with interview requests from media outlets wanting to hear about the Sunday morning that changed everything. I declined most of the attention, preferring to focus on getting my life back to normal. The repairs to my house were covered by the restitution fund, the court established using Nadine's frozen assets. I finally got to build that shed, with no requirements for youth meditation spaces. My woodworking hobby became a form of therapy, helping me process the months of harassment and invasion of privacy. The trial preparations revealed even more disturbing details. Nadine had apparently been planning to have me committed for psychological evaluation, using the surveillance footage edited to make me look paranoid and unstable. She had already contacted a psychiatrist friend of hers who was willing to sign off on the evaluation for a fee. If Blaze hadn't pushed things too far too fast, her plan might have actually worked. There were also documents suggesting she was planning to use similar tactics on other residents who opposed her. She had files on every homeowner with notes about vulnerabilities, financial situations and personal information that could be used for blackmail or manipulation. The FBI agent in charge of the case said it was one of the most extensive surveillance operations by a civilian he had ever seen. Blaze's psychological evaluation required for his trial revealed antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic traits that the psychologist said were likely enabled and amplified by his mother's behavior. He showed no genuine remorse, only anger at being caught. During one recorded session, he actually said he didn't understand why everyone was making such a big deal about him borrowing someone's house. His father, who had initially seemed shocked by his son's behavior, turned out to have his own issues. Investigation revealed he had been sending Nadine money specifically to keep Blaze away from him, essentially paying her to deal with their problem child. He had known about some of Blaze's previous crimes but had chosen to ignore them rather than face the embarrassment of having a criminal son. The extended Kellerman family tried to distance themselves from the scandal, with Nadine's sister giving an interview where she claimed she had always known something was wrong but felt powerless to intervene. She revealed that Nadine had been exhibiting controlling behavior since childhood, once getting their entire Girl Scout troop disbanded because she wasn't elected leader. Former neighbors from Nadine's previous residences started coming forward with their own stories. She had been forced to leave her last community after trying to establish herself as HOA president there and failing. The harassment campaign she launched against the woman who beat her in the election resulted in a restraining order and her family's quiet departure. There was even evidence that Nadine had falsified her qualifications when she first ran for HOA president in Juniper Vale. She had claimed to have a degree in public administration, and experience managing residential communities, but investigation revealed she had dropped out of community college and her only management experience was a failed attempt at running a property management company that was shut down for fraud. The more investigators dug, the more they found. Nadine had been running small scams for most of her adult life, always staying just under the radar of law enforcement. The HOA presidency had given her the perfect cover and authority to escalate her criminal behavior. She had even written in her journal, which was seized as evidence, that becoming HOA president was the best thing that ever happened to her because it gave her real power over people who couldn't escape. Blaisy's online history revealed he had been studying his mother's methods and improving on them. He had spreadsheets tracking which residents were most vulnerable to intimidation, which ones had the most money, and which ones were most likely to fight back. He had actually identified me as someone who would eventually need to be neutralized, which explained the escalating harassment campaign. They had been so confident in their scheme that they had become sloppy. The fake documents were poorly made because they never thought anyone would actually challenge them in court. The surveillance network was illegal, but obvious because they believed their positions made them untouchable. The theft was blatant because they assumed no one would ever audit the books. The arrogance was ultimately their downfall. If they had been more subtle, if Blaise hadn't literally moved into my house, if Nadine hadn't tried to arrest the officers for doing their jobs, they might have gotten away with it for years more. But their belief that they were above the law made them push too far too fast. As the trial date approached, more evidence continued to surface. Other HOA presidents from around the state revealed that Nadine had been trying to create a network of corrupt HOAs, sharing tactics and providing mutual support when residents fought back. She had even proposed creating a political action committee to lobby for increased HOA powers at the state level. The scheme was so extensive that the Attorney General's office got involved, setting up a task force to investigate HOA corruption statewide. They found that while Nadine was the worst offender, there were dozens of other HOA boards engaging in similar if less extreme behavior. The Juniper Vale case became the centerpiece of a broader crackdown on HOA abuse. Legal scholars were particularly interested in the surveillance aspect of the case. The fact that Nadine had been able to create such an extensive network using smart home technology raised serious questions about privacy rights in the digital age. Several tech companies updated their terms of service and security protocols in response to the case. The precedent set by the case extended beyond HS. Employment lawyers were citing it in cases about workplace surveillance. Privacy advocates were using it to push for stronger consumer protections. Constitutional scholars were debating whether HS. LAD rules had been given too much deference by courts in the past. But all of that was secondary to the immediate impact on Juniper Vale. The community that had been divided and fearful was coming together. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years were reconnecting, bonding over their shared relief. The Facebook group that had been a tool of intimidation became a place of support and celebration. Block parties were being planned, something Nadine had effectively banned by requiring permits that cost $500 and were always denied. Children were playing in the streets again without fear of being fined for noise violations. People were painting their doors colors other than the 4 approved shades of beige. The freedom was intoxicating for residents who had lived under Nadine's thumb for years. Some went a little overboard, with one resident painting their house bright purple before remembering that some HOA rules actually did serve a purpose. The new board had to find a balance between freedom and maintaining community standards, but they did so through dialogue rather than dictation. Marcus Washington, who became the new HOA president, implemented weekly coffee meetings where residents could voice concerns directly. Every board meeting was recorded and posted online. Financial reports were published monthly with plain English explanations of every expense. The transparency was revolutionary for an HOA. The community garden that Nadine had claimed was too expensive despite having funds for an $87,000 gazebo was finally approved. Residents worked together to build it, creating bonds that transcended the property lines Nadine had used to divide them. It became a symbol of the community's rebirth. Local schools started using the Juniper Vale case as a teaching tool for civics classes, showing students how citizen activism could overcome corruption. The high school actually invited me to speak about standing up to authority, though I declined, suggesting they invite the teenagers who had found the courage to speak up about Blaise's bullying instead. The real estate market in Juniper Vale stabilized and then improved. New buyers were attracted to what was now seen as a model community for HOA governance. The media attention, once negative, became positive as stories about the community's recovery spread. Property values not only recovered but exceeded pre-scandal levels. Meanwhile, Blaze's trial began with jury selection that took 3 days because of the publicity. His lawyer tried to argue for a change of venue, claiming he couldn't get a fair trial in the county, but the judge noted that the case had received national attention, so moving it wouldn't help. They finally seated a jury of people who had somehow managed to avoid most of the media coverage. The prosecution's opening statement was devastating. They laid out a pattern of criminal behavior dating back years, enabled and encouraged by his mother's position. They played audio from the surveillance network of Blaze bragging about his crimes, laughing about how stupid residents were for not fighting back. The jury looked disgusted. His defense tried to paint him as a troubled youth manipulated by his mother. But this fell apart when they played recordings of Blaze planning crimes on his own, even suggesting ideas that Nadine thought were too risky. The evidence showed he wasn't a puppet but an enthusiastic partner in the criminal enterprise. The most damaging testimony came from his former friends at the boarding school. They revealed that Blaze had been planning to use his mother's HOA position to build a criminal empire since before he was expelled. He had actually gotten himself expelled deliberately to return home and implement his plans, viewing boarding school as too small for his ambitions. When Blaze took the stand against his lawyer's advice, it was a disaster. He couldn't help but brag about how clever his schemes were, seemingly forgetting he was confessing to crimes. He actually corrected the prosecutor on some details of his crimes, making them sound worse than originally charged. His narcissism was on full display. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, said it was one of the most clear-cut cases of entitled criminality he had seen in 30 years on the bench. He sentenced Blaze to 15 years in federal prison, with possibility of parole after 10 if he showed genuine rehabilitation. Blaze's reaction was to scream that the judge was jealous of his genius and that this was all a conspiracy by people who couldn't understand vision. As he was led away, he shouted that he would own the entire neighborhood when he got out, apparently still not understanding that his mother's reign was over and his future was destroyed.